theme is technology, with words like selfie and vape falling into that category. New words often come from technological advances and new things that people are doing. New things come on stream and you have to have a word for them. If you didn't, you couldn't describe that new process or product. For example, in photography, we only ever used to be able to take pictures of the things we were looking at, not ourselves. Or at least not unless we set a timer and ran back into the shot. So when taking pictures of ourselves became a thing, it would have been very cumbersome to keep saying that thing where you make the camera lens face the other way and take a picture of yourself. So we were bound to come up with a word for it: selfie. Probably people came up with a number of words, but it was selfie that stuck. The same is true of the 2020 words of the year, which were a range of words arising from the pandemic context. During this past period, our lives have changed utterly, and we have been in some ways overwhelmed with new things, behaviours and practices that we have had to find new words for or reapply old words to. That's why in 2020 there wasn't just one word of the year in the Oxford Dictionary, there was a range of words relating to the pandemic. Politics is a big theme in the list too, with almost every other word that isn't in the technology theme being in the politics theme. But there are definitely sub-themes there too, aren't there? Or slightly different overlapping themes, if you like. Youthquake and toxic, for example, have come out of campaigning movements like the Me Too movement and climate campaigning, rather than out of mainstream politics like Squeezed Middle and Omnishambles have. This tells us something about who is driving both societal change and language change, doesn't it? In recent history, it might have been or seemed to be the middle-aged white men, but more recently, it seems to be younger people, doesn't it? And they are publicised as having done that too, in the way that they perhaps were not in the past. If you think more broadly about new words in general, rather than just those which make so much of an impact that they become a word of the year, I think you'll find that youth is even more of a factor. Check out this cartoon. Do you know anybody who messages like this? Known as text speak, this style of messaging caused grammar nerds and English teachers everywhere to say that the language was doomed and that children and young people were going to forget how to write in full words and sentences and the language was going to be detrimentally affected forever. But it didn't happen. There are two issues to tease out from this. Firstly, it was temporary, and secondly, it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. My guess is you don't message like this yourself. And if you know anyone who does, they're probably in your parents' generation or even in your grandparents' generation. There is a real irony in the fact that it was older people who made the claim that such language use was bad for the development of language skills in children and young people, when in fact abbreviated texting largely ran its course quickly for young people, leaving older people as the ones who utilise it. We can put this into context by thinking about the history of mobile phone technology. When I got my first mobile phone in the mid-1990s, texting was a bit like Twitter. The number of characters you could type in each text was significantly limited. It was also more expensive than today, with every text message costing money. It made communicative and economic sense then for people to aim to write short text messages, and a key way to achieve this was by using abbreviations. The older a person is, the more likely they are to have lived during the time when this type of communication was necessary, and the more likely they are to be still texting this way. So it is not a young person's issue after all. By the time most of you reading this were using mobile phones, character restrictions and payments for text messages had disappeared, and most messaging had moved to social media or WhatsApp. Yes, you probably still use some acronyms and abbreviations, but you use them creatively and economically, not because you don't know how to write them in full. Which segues me nicely into the second point, that this development, when it happened, was not necessarily a bad thing. At many points in the development of language, language purists have decried the developments, but they have happened and people have continued to understand each other. In fact, just in the same way as it's well documented that learning another language or reading a lot of literature or writing creatively makes us better at understanding how our regular everyday language works, the same went for abbreviated texting like we see in this cartoon. You have to really think creatively and quite technically to develop language like this. I've included a clip in the bonus folder for this week that you might want to check out. It's of a professor of linguistics called David Crystal on an old BBC show called It's Only a Theory in 2009, making the case that texting is good for the English language. He points out that abbreviating language is not new and we've survived it before, and that actually these developments demonstrate significant creativity in those who introduce them. We're now going to explore how language is used between people of different ages. We'll start with how adults speak to babies and young children. I'd like you to do a task about this before we start. I think you'll find that you know much more than you think you do about this. Here's the task. I want you to think about the characteristics of the ways in which adults speak to babies and young children. And I want you to think in particular about any differences of topic, complexity of language, speed, or intonation that there are between how adults speak to adults and how adults speak to babies and young children. I also want you to think about why we speak in this way to babies and young children. So what did you come up with? Some of the patterns in how adults speak to young children, or to use the subject-specific term, child-directed language, are as follows. I'm going to talk you through them. I have divided them into sets: the sound of the talk, the content of the talk, and the power in the talk. And I've colour-coded them for you. So first of all, the sound of the talk. We tend to speak more slowly when speaking to babies and young children. We pause more. We use clearer, more distinct pronunciation and are more likely to reduce our use of regional and social class accents. For example, we might say, "What is that you're playing with?" rather than, "What's that you're playing with?" This perhaps tells us as much about our opinions about the correctness of different accents as it does about the choices we make about level of distinctiveness in our speech. When speaking to babies and young children, we tend to raise our pitch higher than it usually would be. You can think of pitch as the difference between lower and higher musical notes. So to use the most universal example I can think of, if you're singing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, the second twinkle is sung at a higher pitch than the first twinkle. And all of this can be applied to spoken language as well, which also has pitch. Higher pitched sounds are more distinct, and it may also be the case that we do this to try to match our pitch more closely to the child's own pitch. We exaggerate our intonation. Intonation is related to pitch. Where pitch is the overall highness or lowness of a voice, intonation is the variation in pitch within the utterances. Exaggerated intonation is sometimes described in everyday language as sounding sing-song, and examples might be the way we read nursery rhymes, or the way some in-store announcers sound, or the way I just spoke that paragraph. Now we'll talk about the content of the talk. As well as the obvious that we will speak about age-appropriate topics, we do other things with the content. We often call the child by name, often a pet name or a term of endearment. Of course, we all use each other's names sometimes when talking to each other. However, among adults, this is more likely when directly addressing someone, for example, when you first meet up with them or to get their attention. Whereas when adults speak to young children, the use of names is more widespread throughout the different functions that language serves. There is more repetition in what we say. We use shorter, grammatically simpler sentences. We're more likely to say something like, "Can you see the dog?" than we are to say something like, "You may observe that in the near ground a dog is present." I'm being facetious, but you get the idea. And we use baby talk words. These are words that do not have meaning per se in the language and are used uniquely to babies. Now let's talk about the power in the talk. Firstly, we seek responses from children by asking them questions and using question tags. Question tags are words that we add on to the end of non-question grammatical constructions to make them into questions. An example is saying, "The dog is nice, isn't he?" as opposed to, "Is the dog nice?" or "Do you think the dog is nice?" Other examples are, "You're a clever girl, aren't you?" or "We don't touch that, do we?" "We don't touch that, do we?" is also an example of another characteristic of child-directed language, directive language. That is, telling a child what to do. We expand on and or finish children's utterances sometimes. So if a child says, "Doggy," we might say, "The dog is nice, isn't he?" Or, "Yes, the dog is playing with the cat." So why do adults speak to children in this way? In answering this question, you probably mentioned something about education. We tend to think we speak to children in this way to help them learn their language, or to use the correct terminology, to acquire their language. Acquisition is used to reflect the fascinating way in which children acquire language, mostly without formal education. But perhaps this actually means that we don't need to use such specifically child-directed language at all. An important study by Eleanor Ochs back in the 1980s identified that many cultures do not use any form of child-directed language when talking to babies and young children. Crucially, in those cultures there was no difference in the speed or the technical competence with which the children acquired language. So the research shows that we have to speak to children, but we don't necessarily need to speak to them with the child-directed language we tend to use. It is highly important to use fully developed conversation around children. There's no doubt that using baby talk words might play a significant role in bonding or in demonstrating love for a child, but they need regular language used around them to develop language fully themselves. They won't be able to understand all of the conversation, but immersing them in it, using age-appropriate topics of course, will familiarise them with the sounds and the structures which will play a part in enabling them to develop those sounds and structures in due course themselves. So, if we don't need to do it, why do we do it? Clearly, we want to nurture children and enable them to develop and just bond with them and demonstrate that we love them. But perhaps what we are doing is not as empowering as we think it is, and even disempowers them a bit. And on the subject of disempowerment, have you ever noticed a similarity between the way adults talk to young children and the way they talk to older people? If we look at both in detail, there are actually a lot of similarities between them. So why does this happen? Yes, it is fair to say that sometimes older people have more difficulty understanding language due to hearing issues or neurological deterioration. That might explain us using some of the sound-related elements of child-directed language with older people, but it doesn't explain us using some of the content and power-related elements of child-directed language with older people, which indeed we do. This can be very patronising for the older person. Imagine how you would feel yourself being spoken to in this way. We could even say that when we use elder-directed language, as it's called, we are positioning older people in a disempowered position that actually likens them to young children. We could further relate this to older people's position and value in our society. Society's foci tend to be work-related. Depending on our political outlook, or indeed the political outlook of the current government in the country in which we live, the focus is on productiveness, status, and the economy. So when we're not doing that anymore, society positions us as less able and as less powerful, and in turn individual people within society perceive us that way and treat us according to their perception. This seems to be shifting over time in an overall sense, regardless of ideological outlook. We can see the shift in the increased number of representations of active older age that we considered in our other video. We have also had a lot of our priorities and perceptions challenged by living through the COVID-19 pandemic. So it will be interesting to see whether the positioning of and perception of things other than work and the perception and positioning of older people will be the better for that. I certainly hope so. If you would like to reflect further on this and consider how to engage in best practice when interacting with older people, there is an interesting video for you to watch in the bonus content folder for this week. It's a training video for nursing and care work students that gives voice to an older person to respond to the different ways in which she tends to be spoken to, and to talk about the effects that those have on her. As a final thought for this video, I'd like to share with you an observation made by Franklin in 1995, who pointed out that the term child, historically in the English language, was originally used to describe anyone of low status, regardless of their age, and that it continues to express more about power relationships than chronology, although the two are intimately intertwined. That's all for this video. Hope you enjoyed it.